Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 101 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Modern Bar Cart CEO Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining me for another terrific interview episode where we ambush some of the best and brightest spirits and cocktail experts and threaten them with a good time until they share all their closest held secrets. This time around, we hang out with my friends Max and Eli from the Baltimore Spirits Company, and they share some of their extremely special juice while we talk mezcal and amaro. But before we get into that discussion, let's give you the opportunity, as always, to make yourself a drink. This week's featured cocktail is The Last of the Oaxacans, which is a riff on the last word cocktail using smoky, intriguing mezcal. To make it, you'll need 1 ounce of mezcal, 1 ounce of green chartreuse, 1 ounce maraschino liqueur, Luxardo is the most commonly available brand, and 1 ounce fresh lime juice. Since this is a citrusy drink, we want to combine all these ingredients in a cocktail shaker with ice, shake it for about 15 to 20 seconds until it's well mixed and chilled, and then strain into a stemmed cocktail glass. For a garnish, there's really no standard accepted option for this drink, so I like to play around a little bit and add a splash of color that really pops against the eerie green color of the cocktail. I find that a nice dark brandied cherry is a great option for this, and certainly a nod to the maraschino liqueur, but a thin ribbon of grapefruit peel could also be a really, really nice touch. One more thing to note about the Last of the Oaxacans is that it's an equal parts or perfect ratio cocktail. This means that if you want to dial back the ingredient measures from 1 ounce to 3/4 of an ounce for any reason, it's really not going to affect the balance of the drink at all. This comes in handy if you find yourself using smaller vintage cocktail glasses that don't tend to hold as much liquid as modern styles. The main reason I wanted to feature The Last of the Oaxacans is because it's a great use case for Baltimore Spirits Company's Fumis Pumila apple brandy, which we sample later in the episode. And also, come on, you never have to ask me twice to make a chartreuse cocktail. So, now that you're armed with a smoky yet refreshing mezcal drink, let's get back to the main event, our conversation with Max Lentz and Eli Breitburg-Smith of the Baltimore Spirits Company. Some of the things we discuss include why brewers tend to make great distillers and how a dialed-in focus on fermentation can enhance the quality of a distilled spirits program, how Max and Eli took traditional mezcal distilling methods and adapted them for making smoked fruit brandies that pay homage to both the ancient mezcal tradition and the native terroir of the mid-Atlantic. What the heck it means when you see Pechuga on a bottle of mezcal, and believe me, you won't want to miss that. How to build out your mezcal and amaro collections in a fiscally and environmentally responsible manner, and much, much more. During this episode, we sampled through Baltimore Spirit Company's smoked apple brandy and their limited release Pechuga-style version, featuring local persimmons, black walnuts, and paw-paws. We'll talk about what paw-paws are in the interview. We also nose and taste through their 3 excellent amaro offerings, Szechuan, coffee, and Fernet. We'll have images and tasting notes for these beautiful products over on the show notes page at modernbarcart.com/podcast. And if you live in the Mid-Atlantic or in any of the Western states that will soon carry these bottles, I highly recommend you pick up 1 or 2 for your home bar. With that, it's my pleasure to present this wide-ranging and incredibly flavorful conversation with my friends Eli and Max of the Baltimore Spirits Company. Enjoy. Gentlemen, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure.
Can you introduce yourself for our listeners and tell us the story of Baltimore Spirits Company and how you came to be here doing what you're doing today?
Sure. I'm Eli Breitburg-Smith, the head distiller and one of the co-owners with Max over here, and I'll let Max do the background story.
Yeah. My name is Max Lentz. I'm one of the co-owners along with my friend Eli over here. And Baltimore Spirits Company was founded in 2014 with the doors opening for production in 2015. We were working on the project since late 2012, really. And for us, it was really born from the kind of vibrant creative community of Baltimore a lot more than it was born from the craft distilling movement. When we were working on it in 2012, there was no craft distilling in Maryland, and it really wasn't we weren't really kind of involved in the scene in that way to where we thought we saw some people doing stuff, let's do what they're doing. It was more that we have always wanted to be creators in Baltimore. It's why we live in the city. Eli was a founding member of the Baltimore Rock Opera Society, and he became a professional brewer after we spent many years home brewing together after college. Both of us have kind of played a little music casually around town and just been part of the kind of creative scene. And so we were always looking for a space in which we were going to bring something new and exciting to the city. And when we started kicking around this idea of distilling, which was a natural progression from our brewing history, the idea really caught fire in our minds, and we just dove really, really deep. So I think that informs a lot of our decisions. We try to do really creative spirits, and we kind of have done our own little path that might not look a lot like some of the other kind of craft distilleries that are out there.
Totally. Do you think that brewers who then become distillers are different from people who are not brewers and then become distillers?
I think yes. I mean, it definitely depends on the person for sure. But and I was a home brewer, but I wasn't I think you can break down home brewers into different types, and there's like the more engineering focused type, and I was never that. I was more on the flavor side, on the cooking side of it. And so when I went into professional brewing, I kind of took that attitude with me. But you learn a lot that way. Then when you switch over to distilling, I think you maintain that focus on fermentation, and I think that's a really important part for whiskey making, especially, and anything that is fermented, that you're trying to carry that flavor through. The focus on maintaining a good, healthy fermentation, creating flavors in that fermentation, and then getting that over into a barrel or not, but to get to do something interesting with it afterwards.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I feel very strongly about, you hear about this notion that the barrel imparts some percentage. Right. We'll put percentage in air quotes, right, of the flavor of an aged spirit. And regardless of whether we're talking about age, man, I am super zeroed in on the fermentation, because I just think it's the first. It is primary, right? And then there's so much that can be done in terms of like the microbiomes. There's so much that we don't see going on, and to have a really dialed in focus on that, I think just pays much greater dividends than having a real dialed in focus on your barrel program. Of course, having a good barrel program is great and it's important, but I think it's a little bit more intuitive than the focus on fermentation.
Yeah, we definitely, everything we kind of designed the whole system to create a really flavorful white spirit, and I think that whole debate about how much comes from a barrel, I mean, a lot of that is coming from distilleries that operate in a different way than us, and so we definitely designed ours to we have open top wooden fermenters. We use like a Belgian yeast strain. We're counting on some of that secondary fermentation to create extra layers of flavor. This is the whiskey we're talking about primarily, but so
and the apple brandy,
and the apple brandy, yeah. And so sure, like when a lot of change happens in the barrel, most of the change from a lot of these flavors that we know at the end come out of the barrel and interaction with time in the barrel, but you're not going to get to something unique and interesting if you don't start with something unique and interesting. So,
yeah, and totally. If 80% of barrel character, if we're talking about big bourbon makers, right? So everything from 7 to 20 years old, if they're saying 80% is barrel, there's still a huge variation of very bad whiskey to really outstanding whiskey. And so who cares if 80% of a bad whiskey is barrel character? It's the 20% that's going to matter. So the idea that the kind of real key isn't your fermentation and kind of those early decision-making processes and how your stills work and all that stuff is, it doesn't make any sense, because there's still a lot of bad whiskey, whether it's 80% barrel character or not.
And especially, and because we use, classic copper pot stills here, we're also, more, we're getting less of a refined spirit, and so we're starting with a different ester profile. It's going to end up really different later on. I think when they're talking about that, there's a lot of, you're getting more of the cinnamon and vanilla and things like flavors like that you expect from these big distilleries. We're getting a little less of that and a little more of something different.
Totally. So what we're going to do here, after we get a little bit more of your backgrounds and your story, is we're going to focus on a couple things this episode. One is sort of the distilling approach to doing something that is traditionally done in Mexico, right? So you've got two spirits here in front of us that are like a smoked apple brandy, and then we have one that's a Pechuga-style, and both of these are really kind of interesting processes to begin with. With agave being as popular as it is today, I really want our listeners to understand those processes as they can be done anywhere, so that they can really understand what's so special about not only your products, but also the stuff that they're getting from Mexico. So that's part of it, kind of a little appreciation of this style of production. And then we're also going to taste through some of your amari, which is also a really hot topic right now in the spirits and cocktail world. So very excited to taste through those. But could you just talk a little bit more about your company journey? Because when I first met you, you were the Baltimore Whiskey Company, and you had Shot Tower Gin, and you were kind of pumping out some whiskeys as well. When did the name transition a little bit to become, I guess, a little bit more focused on different types of spirits as opposed to just whiskey?
Well, oddly enough, from day one, we were focused on a couple of spirits. The name Baltimore Whiskey Company, obviously whiskey is a big part of what we do, and historic to Maryland. We're kind of part of a history here, even if our rye is not a historically Maryland style rye. It is absolutely a Maryland rye, because it's rye made in Maryland, which is a protected geography in the whiskey world. So that's great, and it was a nod to the fact that we really are partaking in an interesting history. But more than that, it was actually taken from the Baltimore Water Company, which was the first water municipality of the United States. Baltimore is known as the city of firsts because so many things happened in Baltimore for the first time in the U.S. It was this kind of birthplace of new stuff for a long, long time, and hopefully still is. So we wanted to kind of pull something from that. It was kind of just an inspiration for the name, because we thought we were doing something kind of unique and new. But even upon first event, right, if you ever want to be annoyed, put up a sign that says Baltimore Whiskey Company and then serve people gin. And just watch what happens to people's faces when they walk up and they go, whiskey, huh? And you're like, let's get a gin and apple brandy liqueur today.
So we went through the first 2 years of that. Before we had any whiskey.
That must be
so yeah. Our initial inclination was, let's just fight it out. Like we can win it over. People just have to understand. But the idea that, hey, maybe this name is functionally not very great was around early, and we really love the name BWC and Baltimore Whiskey Company, so we were really reluctant to move on from it. But when we moved the distillery, we've been talking about it for so long, there was this unique opportunity with this whole move and reopening into new space, that a slight tweak has really worked for us functionally. So
right, and I can sympathize as coming from a company that underwent a rebrand for different reasons, but it gives you a really good opportunity to kind of like reset the Etch-a-Sketch just a little bit, see what works, see what doesn't. Before we jump into the spirits, can you just tell folks a little bit about this space and what's so awesome about it?
So yeah, we're now located at the Union Collective, which is the new home of Union Craft Brewing, as well as a lot of other cool manufacturers. So basically, when Union had been looking for new space and they couldn't find something that fit exactly what they needed, so they ended up getting a much larger space and asking other local producers to come and join them. So it's Union, us. There is the Charmery making ice cream, Vent Coffee, roasting coffee. There's a climbing gym, and there's more things on the way that should be opening up this summer. So it's a really great place to come and visit. There's food, there's drinks, you can even go for a climb. So
right, exactly. There's an order of operations there, right? You caffeinate, then you climb, then you reward yourself with an ice cream and
recovery shots.
Yeah, we definitely have the recovery shots here. So the lower cal option to the beer.
Yeah,
exactly. Cool. Well,
and the distillery itself, really fun to be able to start from scratch again. Speaking of the rebrand, in the old space we were super bootstrapped, and we would still consider ourselves that way, but it's always a gradient, right? It's a sliding scale of bootstrappiness. So we got to do some really fun stuff here. So our entire distillery is geothermally cooled now, which is really difficult to do in an urban setting, especially one like Baltimore that has a non-potable water table. So we are not engineers, but we're pretty good brewers and understand heat exchange, so we ended up designing our own little geothermal cooling system. Uses 100 gallons a minute of well water, and then it puts the water right back down into the water table, so it's lossless for the water table, and super unique. And we ran it by some engineers and some geothermal guys. They were that ought to work. And
it probably uses a quarter of the energy we would be using if we were using a traditional chilling system. So
wow,
huge energy saver, and really unique system in general.
Yep.
Yeah,
and,
you guys have a great setup. You've had some great events here that I was able to check out. So I definitely recommend. We'll give the address and all the social medias at the end of the episode. But I definitely recommend people, especially if you live in the area, really no excuse not to come down here. You can make an entire afternoon out of it. So let's jump into the two spirits that are kind of like the south of the border production style here. Can you tell us what possessed you to attempt these spirits in the first place?
Yeah, so we had making an apple brandy or a few different apple brandy products was always a part of our lineup from the beginning. There's a long history of apple brandy making in the area. There's a lot of local apple production, so we knew that we could make an interesting spirit from that. And then we were making the apple brandy and drinking mezcal, and we just kind of had an epiphany, really, that we could take our local fruit and make something that has similar flavor profiles to an agave-made spirit.
Yeah, and we are kind of true mezcal nerds, right? We really love the spirit. And we were sitting around drinking mezcal while something was coming out of the still, because we're always kind of working on our palates and doing blind tastings and talking through notes, because we were always trying to kind of refine that whole sensory experience. And we were just thinking, mezcal is essentially an unaged smoked fruit brandy made from agave fruit, right? Like, that is one way to think about it. And it's a very old tradition, and we were kind of thinking, we undertook apple brandy as our very old tradition. So we started thinking about, mezcal has such a unique distillation process as a smoked fruit brandy, which is also its own weird thing, but the kind of production process in general so unique. Kind of what would happen if we took our very historic fruit brandy from our part of North America and combined it with this production process of this other very historic, very old fruit brandy from a very different part of North America, and kind of see how the two spirits would interact. And we dove in. There's actually the only spirit we've ever undertaken where we did no test batch.
We just thought the idea was so good, and that we felt confident at that point, even though we'd only been open for 3 months or something. We were like, yeah, we know what we're doing now. So we just thought, we'll just go for it.
The thinking was that we thought it would be great, and if it wasn't, we'd put it in a barrel and see what happened over a couple years.
Fair. So this is the, can you pronounce this for us?
Fumus pumila.
Fumus pumila, meaning smoked apples.
Yeah.
Right. So let's give it a nose, I guess. It's funny too, because right out the bat, it's smoked, of course. Right, that's kind of like the idea of a smoked thing, is like you rarely want to hide the smoke. If you're going to smoke something, you want to highlight that. It's a very particular kind of thing. But you also, at least I really get the apple that comes through. Like if you look at if you try to picture the aroma of something as a circle, right? Because it kind of is. You're looking right down into the circle of the glass. I get the apple right in the center of that circle, and the smoke notes are kind of running around on the edges of that circle if you try and visualize it. And I also get like an interesting, I think if this was the wine world, I get a bit of a minerality to it almost. Or
I think you do. I think that's the kind of apple eau de vie backbone of the thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And it runs into, we'll talk more about the distilling process, but we do run further into it, and I think some of that comes out later on along with those smoke phenols. I kind of get that smoke right up front, followed by a little bit of apple. One of the things that I think is, we try to do differently, and in the idea of using your local ingredients, we try to use, more American style barbecue, influenced wood for the smoking. So we don't have that kind of mesquite desert smoke that you would get in a mezcal, but it has more of a kind of, we use oak and cherry and a little tiny bit of mesquite, but still you're using different wood because we're in a different place, and that provides a really different nose to it as well.
Yeah, interesting. I kind of get the cherry wood on this. It's got a very specific profile. If you've ever had like specific types of, if you've ever done an experiment where you smoked the same type of meat in several different
Right.
types of woods. You can really tell what that imparts.
We lean heavily on the cherry. I love cherry wood smoked as things as well.
Yes.
Food and otherwise.
I'm having some allergy stuff today, which is always kind of an interesting time to nose things because it ends up really compartmentalizing what you get. So you'll get like different flavors, or you get like really, you find something you've never found before because you're not getting everything else.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a very intense nuttiness.
Yeah.
From my nose on this that I've never really thought about before.
Yeah, as it's opened up, for me, it's definitely gotten more nutty than it was when you first poured. And just a few other details about this before we get into production methods. So this is 100 proof, 50% ABV. In terms of warmth, it's literally right where I would expect it to be at 100 proof. When I tasted it before I looked at the label, I was like, this has got to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50. It was. You get that nice heat like you would expect out of a mezcal. So definitely true to category there. And the palate, I would say, is like the smoke is really there in the way that sometimes when you nose some of these smoked spirits, you get a little bit not disappointed on the palate, but it doesn't follow through. Here it definitely follows through.
Blends the whole way through. I mean, you get smoke at the beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
Really blending with that apple character.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us a little bit about how you make this, and I guess if you can kind of guide our listeners through the production process and maybe tell where you are the same as people who are making mezcal and maybe some places where you make different decisions. I think that'll help them really understand what's special about the process.
Sure. The main kind of difference in production style is that we don't have a pit that we're smoking everything in, so we're kind of limited a little bit by what we're able to do in that regard. So we get our cider in from Brown's Orchard, which is up in Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania, and they bring down the apple cores and peels at the same time. So we take those, we put them onto a smoker that's a whiskey barrel that I turned into a smoker, and then we smoke those for a while until we get the right amount of flavor in there, and then we'll put those into the fermenter to ferment together before the distillation.
So an agave, what Eli's referring to is they'll bury the agave in a pit over open coals. Mesquite would be a really common wood to use there because you need to cook agave to break down the starches into sugar, right? In apple fermentation, the sugars are already readily available, so there's not really a history of needing to cook the apples to make them fermentable. But we wanted to kind of capture some smoke because the side effect of mezcal versus tequila, right? In tequila, you're using indirect heat, so you don't acquire the smoke flavor and you get the nice clean agave. In mezcal production, they cook it over the open coals, so you pick up all the smoke phenols that just get mixed in with the fruit. So we wanted to make sure we captured the smoke phenols because we're not doing a tequila-style apple brandy. That would just kind of be an ode to the apple brandy. We were doing a mezcal style, and a big part of that's a smoke profile. So we smoke the apple peels and the apple cores. And in mezcal, it would be pretty typical. You find fermentation done in a few different places, but wooden vats would be one of the typical places to do it. And we are kind of very happily equipped with big wooden vat fermenters. So that was a really natural fit to do this open air fermentation. Mezcal production typically would use natural yeast that just exists on it. We do not. We pitch yeast. We have kicked around the idea of doing a very long natural fermentation on a special release of Fumus, but to have a controlled fermentation because we want to dial the flavor profile, we pitch yeast in there. And I'll turn it back to Eli for the distillation process, which is, I think, kind of the coolest thing that we emulate really carefully.
Yeah, that's really where mezcal differentiates from other spirits that I know of, and it's when we distill it once, kind of in the traditional fashion, just to get get all the alcohol separated initially, and then we'll put it into our spirit still. And when we do that, we don't actually really do a tails cut. So we continue running the still until we get down to almost nothing, like 0% alcohol coming out of the still. And what that does is that pulls out a lot of the really interesting smoke phenols. And there's really some nice apple notes that come with that as well. So that's really kind of one of the more unique things about it. And so there's no water added into the spirit at all at end. So all of the flavor is packed in there. There's no water added to bring it down to proof at all. So I think it really just makes it a very flavorful and interesting spirit, and just really kind of unique and a little funky too, which is important.
Right. And one, just to clarify for listeners, so like you're talking about the tails, a lot of people when they hear about the cuts, they hear head, hearts, tails, and they think that all you're looking for is the hearts, right? It's logical, right? It's the one on the front and the one on the end are undesirable. The one in the middle is desirable. And then they also hear that the heads are the part that cause like the whiskey blindness, right? So everyone's terrified of methanol and all that stuff. And so just following that logic structure, a lot of people will naturally assume that the tails also contain something harmful, but it doesn't, right? Like
I always describe it as a continuum, because we're doing pot still batch distillation. So, you start with a certain amount of alcohol in the still, and you're pulling alcohol out as you distill, which means you're changing the alcohol content of what's left. The boiling point is changing. So and as you go along that, you're pulling different flavors out the whole time. The heads they don't taste good. I don't know about how much you're going to go blind from it, but not at all. Is the answer. But as you go through the hearts, the flavor is definitely changing the whole way, and it's really about getting the right mixture of hearts and into some of the later on flavors that come out. And eventually, it's about not overwhelming your whiskey with those heavier notes, and that's whiskey making. And then for this, you really it's just those flavors that come out later on end up being some of the most interesting part of it.
For sure. And it's funny, Lefroy recently did kind of a marketing campaign where they put something on their bottlenecks saying like, tastes like I just kissed a mermaid who'd been eating barbecue. And it's like, I don't know, like when you put Lefroy next to this, like this is the mermaid who has just been eating, maybe not a mermaid, right? Maybe a
merman,
an apple orchard employee. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this is really kind of brilliant. And one of the things that I like now, of course, I'm not representative of everybody. I run a bitters company, and you guys obviously like bitterness because we've got 3 amari here. But there's a nice bitterness that kind of lingers with this on the finish. It's super long finish.
Yeah, there's a lot of sweetness too, but the sweet and bitter are a real nice balance.
Right.
And there's a weird relationship between smoke and sweetness, right? Like when you drink really peaty scotches, provided you're not really turned off by peat, they strike you as very sweet, right? There's kind of a sugariness, even just kind of a clean white sugariness to smoke flavor, which really complements the fruitiness of the apple in our spirit. But I think is much more because of the smoke than it is from the fruit, oddly enough.
Right, totally. And apple-based spirits are, along with a couple other distillate bases, really prone to being flabby sometimes. And this is like totally not that. So I think using the apple base and then doing that kind of true to form, like tweaked for the American, like where we are and how you guys are building your brand and what you want to give to consumers, but like still doing that kind of traditional mezcal distillation is just such a great fit, and it's so unique. If somebody wanted to make cocktails with this, what would you recommend? What's popular? What have people done successfully?
Yeah, there's essentially 2 schools of thought, and they're both really fun. And one is to sub it into mezcal cocktails. I've got kind of a house daiquiri recipe, which is essentially like a margarita that's really fantastic. The smoke in our spirit in cocktailing I find to be a little more subtle than a lot of mezcal mixology, where, if you don't like mezcal, there's probably not a mezcal cocktail you enjoy, because it's like it really, really cuts, and I happen to love them. Ours cuts a little bit less than that, but it's not by any means anywhere close to a neutral base for a thing. It's really going to affect the final thing. So I really like doing it in daiquiris, margaritas, mezcal negronis, things like that, right? Like if you kind of sub it in for classic mezcals, you can see how it plays and adjust from there. And of course, the opposite end would be to sub it in for apple brandy, classic cocktails. So I love a smoked apple brandy Jack Rose. Yep. So there's a lot of classics to work with, and they take a little bit of tweaking. This is higher proof than most apple brandies,
right?
So you need to adjust your levels a little, but in general, it works really, really well with citrus.
Yeah, that's like when you said daiquiri, I was like, oh, snap.
Yeah, it's great.
And even if you think about the genesis of the margarita, as far as like David Wondrich kind of reports, it's like, well, like if you look at a margarita, it's a sidecar, and instead of brandy, it's the tequila, and instead of the lemon juice, it's the lime juice.
I think as far as I'm concerned, all of them are sour spins, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that would be tremendous. And another thing to keep in mind with something that has a really robust smoke to it is that sometimes it's great to use in a split base cocktail. So like take your Negroni or your Boulevardier and split it right down the middle. Or take an apple brandy, take your Jack Rose, use half regular apple Jack and then half this. It's like, man, you can do so much with smoke in a split-based cocktail, and it's just a move that most people don't think of. But in the cocktail world, I think it's really just it's a way to make it super unique and put your own fingerprint on it. So if anybody picks up a bottle of this, I'd highly recommend messing around with that as you kind of wade into the cocktail waters. So we've got a handle on, I think, what mezcal or mezcal style distilling looks like. Now, tell us about this next mark that we're going to taste here, and what makes this so crazy special.
So I'm about to pour the Pechuga. And Pechuga is something that most mezcal distilleries in Oaxaca would be making, and they would typically make it once a year. It's their kind of house recipe. Typically, no two are the same, but it's a harvest celebratory style of mezcal distillation where a mezcal producer at the Palenque would take their house mezcal once a year during harvest season, put it in the still, and then put in whatever fruits and nuts and spices are local to that farm or grown on that farm.
Right, literally, that could be like from that tree.
Exactly. It could be a handful of rice and some corn and apples, or it could be guava and pineapple. I mean, there's just like this endless variety. And a big part of it is that most traditionally you would hang raw turkey breast or raw chicken breast in the still. Pechuga means breast, typically referred to a chicken breast or a turkey breast, because your animals are part of your harvest. And this is a big celebration of your farm and what it gives back to your family and stuff. And it's their kind of most precious spirit. It's something you would drink at weddings or anniversaries or with very, very close friends, because it's kind of representative of of kind of everything that you are giving to the community. So since we do a mezcal style spirit, it struck us as a very natural progression to do a true to the project, terroir oriented Pechuga version of it. So we take our smoked mezcal, and in our final run we put in paw-paws, persimmons, and black walnuts, all of which are native to Maryland. And we go out and actually get them, or we kind of talk to local growers, but they're all kind of from Maryland, and some of them are actually wild. And we don't do raw chicken breast in the still. We do a salt-cured Maryland country ham, about a 30-pound ham suspended in the still during distillation, which is about 18 hours.
It's a very long distillation.
Yeah.
We go. I mean, it's a once a year special thing, so we want to make sure we take that extra special
We go
care
as
with
slow
it.
as we can.
Yeah, that is just such a cool way to take something that is not even remotely American and just take it and make it your own. It seems to be kind of like the way you guys approach distilling and putting a product to market, right? It's like taking this thing that is a great thing that already exists and saying, okay, what can we do to add to the conversation, and then give people something that they might not otherwise have an opportunity to enjoy.
Yeah, we always want to be very reverent to history and to what people have made before, but we don't want to just remake something. So
totally,
it's it's always interesting to see what you can do, and especially something in Maryland where there's a lot of local produce and especially things like paw-paws that not everybody knows about, or persimmons. Like we do have some cool fruits and things around, and options for flavoring that really are just kind of unique and worth celebrating.
Yeah, the nose on this is just like utterly remarkable. It's got like cool. you say it's a celebration of the harvest, and this almost to me has that, like if you were in the wine world, you would call this almost a barnyardy nose to it. But to me, it's like it's not like manure or anything. It's like fertility.
Right, like
it smells very fertile.
Paw-paws have like a funky custardness to it. I think you also pull a lot of salinity from the country, whether it comes from the country ham or not. But it's certainly you could think that. The walnuts are all over it, right? Like it's really nutty in the background, because we really wanted to know whether the walnuts would come through, so we did a little walnut maceration before our first Pechuga. And once we kind of had honed in on the flavor, it's so apparent that it's really, if you took it out, you would notice.
Yeah, for me, that's one of the most, like the binding flavor in there is that black walnut, because it really just goes well with everything. And then you get that savory note a little up front and a lot at the end.
It's funny too, because sometimes when you think of walnut, you think of the heavy astringency of the walnut, and sometimes you get that in spirit. Sometimes when people fuck with walnut, walnut does not play along correctly. And with this, it's like, man, you get the oils.
Yeah, and there's not a lot in there. It doesn't take much to go a long way. So
yeah, for sure. And just to give a few more flavor notes on this, I mean, the nose itself is remarkable. You definitely get I get a lot of persimmon. I'm not familiar enough with paw-paw to be able to like pick it out of a lineup per se.
Custardy is a good note.
It's sort of like the flavor for me is sort of like banana, mango, papaya realm, but it has like the funkiness of papaya a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that's interesting to me on the palate, like I when I nosed this, I was like, oh, super fruity, like really cool. You kind of get the hand, you get the fruit. I bet it's going to be very similar to the non-Pechuga on the palate. Very, very different. It's almost desserty. I get like a little bit more dried fruit, like a jammy, dried, fruity type deal on the palate. And also, let me go at it one more time because there's also this really intriguing, almost like anisey or minty style quality to it. Yeah, like in the same way that sometimes when you smell a rye, you get kind of like that caraway mintiness to it, but it's very different than that. It's subtle. This is probably one of the most complex spirits I've tasted in recent memory.
That's the funny thing when you're, tasting, because not most people don't know what Pechuga is, and you're trying to like tell them about it, and their first reaction is, "Whoa, country ham, that sounds crazy," but it's not a crazy tasting spirit. It's really balanced and complex.
Remarkable
and
how it works.
Yeah,
right. But everything really expresses, and it's deservedly, it deserves its own bottle versus the other one. And we think it's pretty special. We only do it once a year. Like the original, our Pechuga is distilled to proof, so everything in the bottle came out of the still, which for both spirits is a really cool aspect. Outside of mezcal, I don't know that you really get that anywhere.
Yeah, it's 53.4% ABV, the batch that we're tasting, and doesn't taste nearly that hot. Yeah. It sips like a 47, 48. So what's the price difference between these two bottles? And the reason why I ask, I don't usually ask this, but the reason why I ask is because it is a special distillation, right? Deservedly, and also like if you look at Pechuga style mezcals on the market, they're an arm and two legs.
Yeah. Yes,
You're only going to have one working arm. Appendage.
Yeah. So the original Fumas Pomelo, which we really want to be part of cocktail culture, we probably sell too cheap when it comes to it, but it's really important to us to have the creators of the industry using it. So you find it in liquor stores around $35, and it puts it in great kind of cocktail range for accounts.
That's crazy.
I know, it is crazy. The Pechuga in-house, you'll see it for $60, and depending on what state you're finding it, $60 to $80. Otherwise, it's shipping. We're shipping a bunch over to California and Arizona and Nevada here in a couple of weeks, and I think it'll be closer to 80 over there. But it's a long trip, and there's only about 500 bottles a year. We feel like there's a ton of value in it. It's also fairly labor intensive to crush up walnuts. And
it took me about 7 hours to process all the paw-paws.
Yeah,
because they had these huge seeds in them, you can't get those in there, so you got to scoop all the seeds out. Vacuum sealed it, and so we were kind of ready to go.
That is, I feel you.
Yep.
That is labor intensive. You should try and get this into Las Perlas in LA. I did a podcast with Pedro Shanahan, who's part of the 7 Grand, and that's one of their bars. They actually do a mezcal collective there. They do a podcast called the Spirit Guide Podcast, which is actually phenomenal for training yourself to be a better taster just by listening to something. They get all these, because they're such a big brand, they get all these brand reps coming in from all over the world. Yeah. So it's a great educational resource, but they also have a great mezcal bar in Las Perlas. And I mean, to have something like this, I mean, they would want you not only to give them this for the bar, but also to come and talk about it. Like it's huge. So definitely check them out.
Great.
Absolutely
awesome.
will. Yeah.
Man, I don't want to move on.
It's hard to move on after that.
I kind of want to linger on this. I can't really think of any other excuses here. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Well, we got the paw-paws originally they were grown in Baltimore City. A friend of mine is a big paw-paw fan.
What is a paw-paw?
Yeah, it's an exotic looking and tasting fruit that's native to our area, native to the Ohio, Maryland Valley region. So I got a friend who's from Ohio, and he kind of introduced me to paw-paws. And as we were, and actually I remember them when I was growing up. I grew up in Southern Maryland, We had them there, but we never ate them for whatever reason. They're really hard to harvest. You got to be there when they fall off the tree, basically. So he introduced me to them, and that kind of like sparked the idea for the paw-paws were more of the inspiration than the country ham. The country ham came a little later.
When we were thinking about, with the natural Maryland protein that, something historic we could put in the still.
But paw-paws, they seem special. Because they're hard to harvest, because they have this kind of really interesting flavor that is hard to nail down. Like, you can't exactly pick out what it is. And it's not like anything else that I know of. So it just seemed like something special to take advantage of.
And what's interesting about paw-paws is, of course, this whole conversation begs the question, why haven't I heard of a paw-paw? Because it's essentially this weird mango that grows wild in a big part of the United States. And Eli touched on it, but they're essentially impossible to cultivate. You can grow them on purpose, but they don't travel. Once you kind of can't harvest them before they're ripe, and when they are ripe, they're going to be rotten in like 3 days. So the way the kind of American food system works, doesn't have time to ripen on the tree, get to a distributor, get to stores, and get out on a shelf, and have 48 hours before it has to be tossed. I mean, it's done by the time it gets to stores. So they're essentially this uncultivatable fruit. You can grow them for yourself, and they're really wonderful. You can also go to Maryland state parks and pick them off trees. You can keep track of the seasons online.
There's a place called Paw-Paw Tunnel out in Oakton, Maryland. It's like a 3,000 foot long tunnel. It's just like a train tunnel or bridge tunnel or something that's not always used anymore. But anyways, it's got, it's historically, people knew about it and used it, but we kind of forgot about it for a while, and it's definitely having a little bit of a comeback. There are some people that are, processing and freezing them, but it's super labor intensive, and they just really don't travel well. By the time you got through a big enough batch of them, half of them would be bad.
Yeah, well, and let me take a moment to explain to our listeners what's so special. Like another thing that's so special about this Pechuga is when you're trying to do what you guys are doing, trying to take something that exists in the cocktail or spirit canon, make it your own, and have it contribute meaningfully and respectfully to a narrative. That is super difficult to do well. Anybody can do it, right? And everybody tries, but to do it well is very difficult. And you almost need to have some sort of poetic resonance with it, right? You need to find something that almost clicks into place. And like you were explaining the story of how the ham all right, well, what's a historical protein? Oh, the ham makes more sense than the traditional. That's adding to the conversation, and so is the paw-paw, because it's this almost an anti-commodity. It can't be a commodity based on how it operates, and that really resonates with what the Pechuga is, because you can't commodify. It's a once-a-year thing, and the fact that you're not just pumping this out constantly keeps it that way. That's a decision that probably loses some money.
Yeah, and I think that, for me, it's important to have some inspiration. You can't just pick an idea out and do it. We want to find something that really inspires us and makes us, because you're not going to come up with something new if you're not inspired. That's kind of my opinion.
Right.
And one of the things that drew Eli and myself to distilling in the first place is there's a little bit of a frontier that's accessible, right? We feel like there's a lot of open space for creativity and expression, and a lot of things that aren't being done that really could be done at a very, very high level. And our list of passion projects is longer than we'll ever get through already. And we have to kind of pick and choose. I'm looking at an imaginary list on the wall.
Yeah.
We kind of pick and choose when we have time, which is not all the time, to do new stuff. But in brewing, it's very hard to do brand new stuff. Now, there's always tweaks and spins and things that are done very well. And I think in brewing, the current battle is which people are actually kind of doing it just a little better than everybody else rather than doing something brand new.
Totally.
But in distilling, it's a little bit of both. There's a lot of brand new stuff. There's a lot to add to the conversation, a lot of places to take things they haven't been before. That's very attractive to people who want to do new stuff. And the reason our lineup is what it is, it's not because we get an idea and then run it against our values. We say, oh, it's not new enough, we shouldn't do that. It's because the things that actually light us on fire are the things that nobody else is doing, because there's an opportunity to bring something new. And there's nothing more exciting than showing somebody something that they've never heard of, that nobody's doing, and also have it be amazing.
It's funny. There's a kind of a litmus test that I think you can do as a consumer, as an informed person, to figure out why a distiller is doing something. And what you were describing is there's still a frontier. Well, other people who are interested in that frontier are interested in it for financial reasons, in many cases, right? So sometimes there's that rush to get where nobody else is, to find the white space so that you can soak up all the money that is available in that white space. And I think the litmus test that you can do as a consumer is to make eye contact with the product, to listen to the stories, and see if it feels like the distiller is rushing. And one thing that's really strikes me about you and your products is that nothing feels rushed. Everything feels like it's there, like everything is thought out. There's a reason for everything. There's a reason for the wooden open fermenters. There's a reason why you're pitching yeast as opposed to doing natural yeast. There's a reason why this only comes out once a year. And that to me is a really important signal that says we're not doing this because we're rushing to make money on it. We're doing this for a reason. And I think that's a good litmus test that you can run as a customer. So with that, I think we should maybe jump into some of these beautiful amari here.
The amari, yeah.
What do you want to do first?
I think we'll taste from least bitter to most bitter.
Szechuan on up.
Szechuan up?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Szechuan. So this is something I think most people associate with Chinese food.
Yeah.
What is Szechuan? What's the flavor, and why'd you choose it?
So we'll get into some inspiration here, but Szechuan peppercorns are not even actually peppercorns. They're a seed covering on a flower, and the flavor is light and fruity and floral. There is this anesthetic quality to them that is interesting and an important part of Szechuan cooking. And people also will think of the Szechuan pepper, which is very spicy, but this is a totally not spicy spirit at all. But yeah, this one I kind of was inspired. I was trying to make something for my sister's wedding, and I came up with the first version of that was for their wedding, and then it was about a year and a half later when we released this, so we did a lot of work in between to really dial it in to where we wanted. But I think it's surprising in the flavor profile. You expect something, really in your face and really not subtle. What it actually has is a lot of subtle, fruity, floral flavors to it, really kind of tied together by that Szechuan.
Right, and on the nose, the immediate flavor note that I get is like husky. It smells like, I literally, several hours ago, I was using a giant mortar and pestle to crush coriander seeds. Mm-hmm. And those have that very kind of it's a seed, just like a Szechuan peppercorn. And so they've got some of that same kind of it's very difficult to describe other than, it tastes like the husk, or it doesn't taste, it smells a little bit like the husk of that. And you get that beautiful floral white pepper kind of macy aroma.
There is some powdered mace in there as well.
Okay. Well,
there we go.
I'm not totally broken. I'm only broken on the inside.
No, it still works.
Cool. Well, I'll take a little sip of this. Now, talk to me about sugar, because amari, obviously they're sweetened. How do you approach sugar from a distilling standpoint? Because when it comes to the end product, I feel like the sugar profile is something that is really going to affect how approachable it is to consumers, and it obviously the sweetness, which is a taste, not a flavor, has a very large impact on how the overall flavor is perceived. So how do you guys think about that?
We have messed with a lot of different styles of sweetening. We are also in constant R&D, right? And as we talk about the amaro, we'll see how some of our failed R&D experiments turned into great experience that we pulled into the amaro when we were working on them. But we've sweetened with white sugar, we've sweetened with molasses, we've sweetened with juice, we've sweetened with 3 different kinds of raw sugar. We have done some caramel cooking experiments. We have bought a little test thing of glycerin on the internet. We have gone from glamorous to not. These are very simple. I'd say we in general steer away from kind of cloying sweetness. We have a target that we kind of started with and adjusted. 2 of these are at those target, and one of which we made kind of very purposefully drier than that. Mm-hmm. But for our amaro, we use raw demerara sugar only.
It's a nice
yeah, demerara is nice. It's like a partially refined, so it's not quite, so there's like panela, which is totally unrefined. This is partially refined, and the nice part about it, I think, for me, is that it adds a little mouthfeel to it as well. The white sugar is going to have, I think, a little bit less of that going on, and it has its own flavor, so it's going to add a little complexity along the way as well.
Right. I do get, as this opens up, a little bit of orange on the nose, which is really nice. And you'd think of like a pepper or a peppercorn or any sort of spicy product that, the temptation is always to see how spicy you can. It's a temptation that's sort of hanging in the clouds when it comes to spicy things. And what I like about this is that you very deliberately kind of avoided that temptation. It's there. You definitely get more of the floral notes. I'm getting almost like a jasmine type aroma and flavor right on the back of this, and it's just thinking about the potential cocktail applications for this, like to stick this in a cool like rye Manhattan kind of format, like to swap this in for a black Manhattan. I know we have a product that we might talk about in that context coming up, but how cool is that? Like, it's great.
And you can kind of vary, if you put a little bit in, then it's an old-fashioned spin. If you put a lot in, and it's a Manhattan spin. Works both ways. The kind of base concept for this is our lightest, most floral, fruitiest expression. So kind of in the Maletti or Montenegro style of the kind of really light, citrusy thing. So we also like it in a spritz. You've got to play with it a little bit, but works really, really well. I think you want a slightly less dry champagne than with Aperol.
I think so.
And a lot, that also speaks to the sugar profile, right? I think a lot of Amari are made with glycerin. I don't know it for a fact, but there's something about glycerin that after we got a little bottle just to like see what it was like, after like tasting it and putting it in things, I think you can just get it when it feels slick in your mouth. And it has a very particular kind of sweetness. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of glycerin in there. And I was not using that means sometimes you have to supplement with a little extra sugar because it's just not as sweet as some others.
For sure, yeah. And when you said Montenegro, I was like, that's it. That's that kind of orange that I'm getting. So very, very cool. And I mean, like, just thinking about peppercorns in stuff. There's so many ways to do it poorly. So it's great to see like a really nice version of this. So.
Yeah. And the genre is a really natural fit for us because it gets to do kind of our thing where, we got into Amaro because we adore the spirits and are incredibly reverent of the makers. So a lot of the kind of bases for our Amari are very traditional and use a lot of traditional botanicals, in our own kind of, and we arrange them in the way our own tastes kind of dictate with our own sensibilities, but they're all kind of taken in a unique direction. And that's kind of one of the things that Amaro has always been doing historically. It may have started in a very small region of Italy, but it's really made all over the world now. And it's one of the widest categories. Like we got into gin because you can do a lot of fun, creative stuff. But I mean, it's nothing compared to the width of categories and the width of flavor profiles that you find in Amaro.
Yeah, for sure. So what's this in the glass now, the second mark here?
The second one, this is our kind of medium bitter. It's a darker flavor profile. We do three, and really none of them are very much related to one another. So this is our coffee Amaro. I don't think the Italians really do any coffee Amaro. Now, they do put Amaro in coffee, but coffee as a botanical there's something very American to that idea. I think the Italians are a little more traditional about
they're not doing cold brew and lattes very often.
Right? Yeah. But coffee as a botanical is a very American style, new world
right?
kind of idea. So this has a kind of a classic Amaro base, medium bitter, but coffee, chocolate notes from cacao nibs, a lot of citrus peel in there as well.
Ooh, yeah, lemon.
Yeah, the bitter orange, and sweet orange, and I don't know lemon.
No lemon.
Interesting. I'm getting a bright note on it though.
Yeah.
So like
I think it's that bitter orange has like a really distinct flavor that when I smelled it, I got it really clearly this time. This is one of the spirits that for me that we make. I mean, I love them all. But every time I have it, I'm like, oh man, it just like jumps out at me.
It reminds you like why.
Yeah.
Well, it was important to us to have it drink like an Amaro, not a coffee liqueur.
Yeah.
Which is a tricky thing to walk. If you're going to call something a coffee Amaro, coffee really needs to be central to the palate, but it can't just be Kahlua Part 2 with some bitterness, So it's a pretty complex spirit, and we think coffee sits really naturally in the center without kind of being overwhelmingly coffee forward.
For sure. And do you use a specific dedicated bittering agent? I mean, we're talking coffee here, so.
So we have, there's a wide range of bittering agents. We pick from a few of them, but the one that we feature in this, there's two actually, is Angelica and Orris. And so we're that's on that more round bitterness, less on the, gentian is that very back of the tongue, like super intense bitterness. There's none of that in there. I really love Orris personally. It's got that woodiness to it.
And dusty.
Yeah, dusty, woody. It really makes sense with coffee. That's in the Szechuan as well because it's a little bit less intense.
It totally does. Yeah, I was just had my hands deep in a bunch of Orris earlier today, and it's like it's so cool to be able to like pull out that tasting note of like, yeah, it tastes dusty, which is like, how is that even remotely a compliment? And yet, with the coffee and especially with the sugar in here, you kind of want a little bit of that woody kind of like almost like a stemmy flavor.
It's amazing to me how many flavors sound terrible but taste so good, like dusty, barnyard, or medicinal.
I use all eau de vie fruit brandies. I think they're linked together by a soapiness, which I love, and I always tell consumers that, and I'm like, just not in a bad way, and they get it.
Yeah, just try it, you know? Yeah, it's funny how we make metaphors with our brain, and you know, I think what's important, you know, for listeners out there who, if you're trying to become a better taster, I think it's just important to be accurate with those notes and not judge, just be accurate, like taste, like specifically taste your spirit and write down what you're tasting, not a kind version of what you're tasting, because you're trying to be objective here and just see what it is. And the only way to be objective is to, you know, fine tune your tasting notes to what's actually there, as opposed to like vanilla or smooth, or, you know, like that is actually the allure of tasting notes, is that you can write down something that would otherwise be taken really poorly and have it be a great compliment.
Yeah.
So beautiful. Well, this is a really exciting liqueur for me.
We forgot one thing,
go ahead.
Which is we use cascara in there as well.
Oh, yes.
Which is the husk of the coffee bean, and that adds a really interesting like earthy hibiscus. The cascara we're using right now is also a little smoky. So that's really a unique factor in there, which kind of brings it a little bit away from the being too much coffee. I think, which is really nice.
Yeah, and it's part of the coffee bean, so it's a natural fit, and it's interesting to see, because I feel like coffee drinkers and cascara tea drinkers are very different people, but it's interesting to see how the two very different flavor profiles from the same plant can kind of complement one another.
Absolutely, just in the same way that sometimes you'll use a root of something, and then sometimes you'll use that thing's flower.
The leaf, and you didn't even know they were the same plant. Looking at you, cilantro.
Yeah. Totally. So, well, you know, I think coffee's not dangerous. It's a tricky category, because coffee's a loaded, not term, but
there's a lot of expectations.
Yeah, there are a lot of expectations, and it's funny to see people react to it. But this, I mean, like, just thinking about the cool whiskey cocktails you could do with that, with just a touch of it too, because I don't think is it a little sweeter than the Szechuan?
It's not. It's just the profile there. Yeah. We use the same like sugar loading content. So
because what I got, I was like, oh, this is sweeter. But then when I like tried to check that against the mouthfeel, I was like, but the mouthfeel's not different. So I wouldn't assume there's more. So there's got to be a story behind this difference in sweetness that I'm perceiving.
Yeah,
I think it's cooking spice on the Szechuan side dries it out, whereas the kind of chocolate citrusy notes of the coffee makes it feel. You just kind of associate it with the sweetness.
Yeah. So what's this last pour that we have?
So number 3 is our Fernet, which, speaking of expectations, so if any of your listeners haven't had Fernet, the most famous brand would be Fernet Branca. It is a polarizing spirit in that it is a very bitter spirit. Fernet is kind of its own little subcategory of amaro. It tends to be more bitter than other styles, focusing on a minty flavor, and it tends to be less sweet and higher proof. And ours hits all those marks, but we wanted to do a little bit more of a fresh mint take on the Fernet genre and a little bit less of the medicinal mentholic mint that Branca and some of the other Fernets have really nailed down. So ours is more fresh mint, licorice, and a very long, more bitter, less sweet finish. It's 100 proof. I think it's the only 100 proof Fernet out there, but still sips very nice. And we feel like, most importantly, when we finished it, that it really upheld the bargain of Fernet. That it's a digestif, there's no mistaking it. It's a palate cleanser, there's no mistaking it. And it has the expected bitterness, even though we feel like it's very much its own thing. And we've gotten some really positive responses from some real Fernet nerds and some real kind of bartenders that had high expectations when trying it. And we're kind of very proud of it.
Yeah, you totally get the licorice on the nose. I'd say on the nose, the licorice and the mint are the two dominant notes. And
I get, there's a lot of that same bitter orange. It's really a prominent one for me that I really enjoy in there.
Well, we had a bitter orange shortage last year, so maybe you guys are responsible because
Maybe.
you obviously using a lot of it.
We do use a lot.
So what bittering agents do you use in this? Because it seems like they might be different.
They are, yeah. So I still like to include some Angelica in almost everything because it's just got a lot of character to it. But there's gentian and cinchona, which are a little more intensely bitter, which is important. You want that lasting bitterness, slightly building as you drink it, and that's like very important to the style.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does build, like it builds.
Yeah.
It's funny how the volume almost kind of like cranks up as you sip it, which is like, I think that's kind of the hit. That's like the little bit of adrenaline that I think that like bitter nerds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Living on the edge.
That's right. How much can I take?
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, Fernet is a totally polarizing thing, and it's just because bitterness is polarizing, right? Like we're predisposed to dislike bitter things because bitter equals poison, and yet a lot of bitter compounds have these nutrients that we're predisposed to crave.
Some people like skydiving.
Yeah.
Oh my God. My aunt, uncle, stepdad, and cousin are all going skydiving in like a couple weeks. I have to go out to California for a graduation. They're all, it's funny because they're going skydiving, and then like you ask me or my mom or like the other half of the family, we're like, no, are you kidding me? Like, it's totally fine here. The binary outcome is like you're either gonna land fine or you're not.
I'm past the point where it's like something I really want to do.
Yeah,
I would do it.
I would do it, but
I've lost the urge of like, I'm not Googling skydiving anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so this, I think, is that it's funny. I feel like you guys would appreciate this, but there's a term that I really like called benign masochism. And the idea is to kind of like hurt yourself a little bit while knowing it's safe.
Like being a small business owner.
Yes.
Or is that just sadomasochism?
Yeah. We don't know we're safe. That's the problem. Yeah, it's different. It's definitely different.
I'm in the middle of a 15 to 17 hour workday right now, so I can kind of relate. But so that's kind of fun. Like, it's funny. I had a friend named Mike who actually I think lives in Baltimore now, and he once explained to me like why he was a smoker. He's like, I like doing it because when I breathe in, I feel like I'm killing myself, but just a little. And there's something to that with bitterness, and Fernet is kind of the pinnacle of that, at least in the social consciousness of people who know about Amari. And so this is a really cool thing to be able to contribute to the conversation, knowing that you've kind of twisted it a little bit with that really fresh mint as opposed to that more medicinal tasting.
Yeah, it's a little, I mean, on the spectrum, I would put it definitely less intense than Branca.
I'd put it on the approachable side.
Yeah. We still want things to be approachable. We want to be able to pour it for somebody who
enjoyable would be a word that we
enjoyable,
like to,
yeah. So someone that's never had either, or has had Branca and been a little turned off or whatever, would try ours and maybe think it was a little more enjoyable.
There's something about gentian too. Like if you think of Suze, it's almost got a lemony characteristic to it, and I feel like that actually balances us out. Because if there wasn't that like slight sharpness that kind of activates your salivary glands in the same way that sourness or acid would do, then you might be at risk for having something that's just dun in the basement, being deep and dark and brooding. But you've got that nice little lift on the end, and that's really carries through the finish here. So I think, like, having tasted these three side by side, I mean, I've had them before, but man, it's such a treat to have a cool portfolio like this in front of us. Did you want to share anything with our listeners about projects that you are currently working on, special stuff going on, maybe events you're doing?
There's an endless stream of things coming.
Just mashed bourbon.
Just mashed our first bourbon. So if you are completely uninterested in everything else we do, including our world-class rye whiskey here, then check in on us in about 4 years.
4 years or so, yeah.
So that's going in the still tomorrow. That is exciting. I'm always excited for new stuff. We just released a one-off eau de vie pear brandy, which we've got a little lingering, but we reserved half of it for a special project that is really not ready to talk about. But that's coming. We just distilled a Genever. Half of it went into barrel, and half of it will be released as white.
It's a collab with McClintock. So we didn't get into nerdy whiskey talk, but we took our low wines and traded those and used our own botanicals on each other's low wines. So
yeah,
I will say that one thing I really like about Maryland is that the Distillers Guild here is really good at collaborating, and you guys are all pretty friendly by and large. And
that's one thing that I took out of the brewing industry is that, the brewing industry, people are super collaborative, very friendly, and I think that is something that everybody benefits from. There's no reason, in my opinion, to be secretive and not friendly with your neighbors. So
At ADI this year, were you at ADI?
I was at the judging.
Okay, that's right. I remember that. You were on your way there. The first time you dropped bitters here, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
So I went to one of the guild talks, and our guild president, Jamie Wyndon, was part of the panel. And what was really kind of clear by the end of it is that Maryland's guild was so much kind of more put together and effective and collaborative than all the other guilds that were kind of represented. They were very kind of focused on infighting or had no real organization. And we feel like the Maryland community of distillers is special and noteworthy and worth talking about. We kind of really like to hold everybody up, and we expect great things from Maryland Distilling, and we hold ourselves to very, very high standards, which we hope that comes through in our spirits. We never have put anything in a bottle that we thought wasn't ready and we'll just tweak it later. We've been in some positions where it would have made a lot of sense to do it, but we never have, and I think that there's a lot of other distillers in the state that are like that, and kind of having people, we want to hold other people to the same standards, and so of course we'll help, and other people of course have helped us, but essentially whenever anybody's called another distiller in the state looking for guidance, I think we're in a unique community where you'll always find it.
Absolutely. And it's funny too, you always hear, rising tide floats all boats and stuff. It's like, man, it's one thing to say, but it's another thing to see it. And, just the openness, like the fact that you guys had this beautiful, educational program here where Nancy Fraley came out and did this. And then I got a call from Jamie, the president of the guild, and was like, hey, we've got some open spots. I'm not from Maryland. I work with a lot of Maryland folks, but just to be able to come into that environment, it's a real great treat for me. So let's wrap this up. Let's talk about some advicey things for our listeners. Eli just ran off to tend the stills.
Yeah.
The little metal dragons out there. We talked a lot about mezcal today and amaro. So you seem to be a guy who has done a decent bit of tasting through that. For somebody who is maybe new to spirits and is intrigued by some of the stuff that we tasted today, maybe some of the tasting notes, do you have any recommendations for how to work your way into this space, which can sometimes be expensive or cost prohibitive?
I do. And they're really both the same. I think mezcal and amaro are in similar movements right now. So I think we can kind of talk about them as one.
Right.
I think in a lot of parts of the country, the best thing to do would be to find the places that are specializing, right? So Baltimore has some really obvious ones. There is a historic amaro bar where not only can you go try a lot of current amaro, but there's a vintage amaro list, and there's similar mezcal accounts around.
What spot is that?
W.C. Harlan's would be the kind of original amaro bar of Baltimore. And there are more, Amy Ward at our bar has put together a wonderful bar there, and she's done a lot to kind of spread bitters awareness through the city, and there are more. There's kind of more cropping up, right? But originally, I think W.C. Harlan's by Lane and Pam, who runs the program there, was really kind of the original amaro focused bar. And going and trying the vintage stuff is great, but I wouldn't say that as an entry level, that's what you need to do. You don't need to go and drive a 1971 Ferrari. You can just drive the regular Ferrari.
Interestingly enough, the Ferrari is a shot, half Fernet, half Campari.
There you go.
Both Amari.
So I would talk to people who know, right? I wouldn't. Now you may live next to a really great liquor store that's got a great selection, but there's a lot of amaro and mezcal both. Now mezcal's price has jumped quite a bit over the last 3 years. But it's still not really prohibitive, especially because drinking at home means that you're essentially spending, even on a nice bottle, $2 or $3 a drink. Just not a big deal. If it keeps you in, you're going to save money. But I would say talk to people who have experience. Get your liquor store's opinions if that's what you have. The best thing, though, because there's nothing like trying a variety, and amaro is such a wide genre that going to a bar, and if they can do half pours or anything, just try as many things as you can. And there's really so many you can try that are not cost prohibitive, and there's no reason to jump up. I wouldn't say that there's a really direct correlation between price and quality in either mezcal or amaro. I will say in mezcal, with the kind of proliferation of American distributed mezcals, that some of them are not as traditional as others. Without kind of a lot of Googling, which of course anybody's welcome to do, there's not a ton of ways to kind of differentiate which ones are more traditional and ones that aren't. But I will say, skew to the higher proof stuff in mezcal, because the most traditional mezcal, there's no water added to bring it down to bottling proof. Same as our smoked apple brandies. And that typically you won't find below about 93 proof. If it's below 93 proof, they almost certainly added water to it to bring it down. So 93 proof and up, and that's probably a pretty good starting point, but it's a deep rabbit hole. But I don't think there's a lot of like really bad mezcal out there. And there's really not a bunch of bad amaro out there, especially if you start with the Italian stuff, the older brands, which can be very affordable. Then that's just a really great start.
Right. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think, it's going to be tricky for somebody to put together a decent mezcal collection without spending a couple $100s on a number of bottles. I would also say I learned something interesting on a podcast called The Speakeasy, Souther Teague, David Bolte, very, very good educational podcast. But they were interviewing someone from Delmegay, and something to look at with mezcal might be the presence of the word espadín. This tends to be the most often cultivated type of agave, which means that the people who are bottling it are interested in all likelihood in sustainability, which is a big problem in mezcal right now. So if you're concerned with that, if you want to vote with your wallet, so to speak, espadín is going to be the most common thing that you encounter, at least here in the US. And it's a way to at least somewhat kind of pat somebody on the head for doing something hopefully good.
There's a give and take there, right? Because part of the allure of mezcal is that they can use any agave they'd like, whereas tequila is blue agave and that's it. It's one species, so sustainable in that people are growing it for tequila. Espadín is a lot like that for mezcal, but I would say if you want to kind of broaden your scope, that there's pretty good reason to try non-Espadín things, wild agave, things like that. And some of the people who are harvesting wild agave are also planting agave. It would be worth your time to kind of try and understand who the kind of environment conscious growers are. I would say that the producers are probably not the people who are most responsible for the depletion of wild agave, as much as the demand of the distributors who are kind of asking them to do a lot more than historically they have. And right now mezcal's at a weird
15, 20, 30 years to grow. I mean, you can't plan for that.
So we're in a weird space where the demand is higher than it's ever been, and so producers are asked to produce more than they ever have.
Without any warning.
Without any warning, right?
Yeah.
And so there'll be some catch up, and of course we hope that there becomes cultivation of these agave plants, and espadín grows faster, which is also one of the reasons that they are cultivating it versus some of the ones that take twice as long to kind of get ready.
But hey, the good thing for us is that apples grow every year.
And apples grow every year.
So yeah, those are some really good thoughts on mezcal. I'm gonna have to think about that myself because it's a category I'm also very interested in. Eli, my question for you in the advice category pertains to people who want to get their hands dirty. You came from a brewing background, obviously started with home brewing. What advice do you have for people when it comes to fermenting things, whether it has to do with yeast or with just pitfalls to avoid? Because I know that our listeners are very much DIY folks based on the feedback we get on social media, via email, tons of questions pouring in about, hey, trying to do this, what do I do? When I've got a brewer cornered, I kind of want to address the fermentation side of things, kind of take us full circle to what we started talking about.
Yeah, I think on the fermentation side, my advice is to relax and find out what's out there, because there's a lot of, that's kind of, I started off working in a homebrew shop. That was my first step on the way to becoming a professional brewer. And, you run into people that are so worried about every little step that they're missing the kind of enjoyment of the process and the magic of fermentation, and the flavor that can get created there. You definitely, obviously when you're fermenting for homebrew and everything, you got to worry about sanitation. There's all these things you should worry about, but it's not that hard to get to that point and then kind of get to the rest of it. You don't need to spend all your time focusing on that very nitty gritty. Did I, sanitize this for the exact 5 minutes that it says on the bottle, right? You just kind of there's a kind of threshold point.
I've got a closet that's at 68
Yeah,
degrees,
right,
and I'm supposed
yeah.
to ferment at 67, and I've just decided not to brew beer.
And part of what it kind of speaks to me is the history of brewing. Like I said, I was an anthropology major, and I definitely am a history person. And so, you look back at the fact that people have been doing, fermenting things for a long time, 7,000, 10,000 years or longer even, making beer for 10,000 years and fermenting wine and other fruits for a lot longer than that. So, people have done it before they knew exactly what all of the science behind it was. And that's how we kind of came to the flavors that we have today. So maybe think about what got us to this point and what is interesting along the way.
It's funny, I had a conversation with a guy named Brian Davis who runs Lost Spirits out in LA, and he told me this freaking hilarious kind of like parable of how like yeast have actually evolved us.
Yeah.
Like they have trained us to keep them alive. And so it's just such a funny take. Yeah, I like the advice of like just relax. I don't think that advice applies to sanitation if you're going to try and consume something. But like you're right. Well, that's a really low hurdle. It's a really low hurdle. Like sanitation is a very basic thing. So once you get an understanding of that, you really don't need to worry about that 1 degree between 67 and 68 degrees, So, I do encourage our listeners to get their hands dirty. I encourage them to sample your products. And as we close out here, can you tell our listeners how to find you digitally and in person?
Yes, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram is all at Balt Spirits Co. We are at the Union Collective, which is very Googleable, in Baltimore City, right next to Hamden. Most people would just consider it Hamden, really. And then, of course, we are all over Maryland State in bars and in liquor stores. We are in D.C., we are in Illinois and Louisiana. And next month, we will officially be in California, Arizona, Nevada. Shortly following that, we'll be in Washington State. So we are slowly growing our footprint and very excited to kind of share what we're doing with a larger audience. And hopefully more after that. But that's kind of the current news.
Guys, congrats. That's huge.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for being on the show. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's 2 big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Modern Bar Cart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning. So remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and production assistance by Samantha Reed, distilling and flavor insights courtesy of Max Lentz and Eli Breitburg-Smith of the Baltimore Spirits Company, a cameo appearance by a Maryland ham, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2019.